Have you ever noticed how younger people almost never call each other anymore? For many older generations, calling someone feels completely normal. It's quick, direct, and often the fastest way to solve a problem. But for Gen Z, picking up the phone can feel uncomfortable, even stressful. Instead, they'll send a message, or a voice note, or sometimes several short messages spread out over a few minutes. That difference might seem small, but it reveals something much bigger about how communication has changed across generations. Before we go further, tell me where you're watching from and which generation you belong to. Because depending on when you grew up, the idea of avoiding phone calls probably feels either completely normal or slightly confusing. To understand why this shift happened, it helps to start with the environment each generation grew up in. For baby boomers and much of Gen X, the phone was one of the most important tools in daily life. Calling someone was often the only immediate way to reach them. If you wanted to talk to a friend, schedule something, or ask a quick question, you called. And because phones were usually attached to a wall or a corded receiver in the house, those calls often happened in shared spaces. Families heard each other's conversations. Teenagers waited for their turn on the phone. Sometimes you even had to talk to someone's parents before reaching the person you wanted. Phone calls were normal because they were the central communication technology of the time. Millennials grew up during a transition period. They still remember landlines and calling friends after school, but they also witnessed the rise of texting, instant messaging, and eventually smartphones. For millennials, both calling and texting feel natural because they experienced both worlds. But Gen Z grew up in a completely different communication environment. By the time many of them started using phones, texting was already dominant. Smartphones had already replaced landlines. Messaging apps, group chats, and social media had become the primary way people stayed connected. So instead of learning communication through phone calls, Gen Z learned it through text-based conversation. And that difference changes how communication feels. Phone calls require immediate responses. There's no pause. No time to think about what you want to say. You have to react in real time. Texting works differently. Messages allow time to think, edit, and respond at your own pace. That small difference creates a completely different communication experience. For Gen Z, texting doesn't feel like avoiding conversation. It feels like a more controlled and comfortable way to communicate. There's also another factor that shaped this behavior: digital social environments. Gen Z grew up communicating through screens from a very young age. Group chats with friends, messaging through social media, sending memes, links, short messages, or reactions. These forms of communication emphasize short bursts of conversation rather than long, uninterrupted dialogue. In that environment, phone calls start to feel unusual. They demand sustained attention in a way that texting doesn't. Technology also changed expectations around availability. Older generations often saw communication as something that happened at specific times. You called someone when you needed something or when it was time to catch up. Younger generations experience communication as constant but flexible. Messages are sent throughout the day. Responses may come immediately or hours later. Conversation becomes something that stretches across time rather than happening all at once. That flexibility is a big part of why texting feels more natural for younger people. But there's another psychological reason behind this shift. Control. Text communication allows people to manage social interactions more carefully. You can think before responding. You can rewrite a message. You can decide when to respond. Phone calls remove that control. Once the call begins, the conversation unfolds in real time. For a generation that grew up navigating complex digital social environments, that lack of control can feel uncomfortable. Some researchers have even found that younger people often associate unexpected phone calls with urgency or stress. When a phone rings suddenly, many Gen Z users assume something must be wrong. Because in their experience, most normal conversations happen through messages. The phone call becomes reserved for situations that feel serious or important. This doesn't mean Gen Z dislikes communication. In many ways, they communicate more frequently than previous generations. But the structure of that communication has changed. Instead of long phone conversations, it often looks like dozens of short interactions throughout the day. A quick message, a reaction, a meme, a short update. Over time, these small exchanges create a continuous stream of connection. Another reason texting dominates younger communication is that modern technology blends communication with everything else people do online. Messages sit alongside photos, videos, music, and social media content. A conversation can shift instantly from talking to sharing something interesting. A link, a video, a screenshot. Communication becomes integrated with the digital environment people already live in. Phone calls, by comparison, feel separate from that ecosystem. You have to stop what you're doing and focus entirely on the conversation. For generations that grew up multitasking across digital platforms, that shift in attention can feel disruptive. Cultural expectations around communication also evolve as technology changes. For example, older generations often interpret a phone call as more respectful or more personal. Calling someone shows effort. It shows that you're prioritizing the conversation. But younger generations sometimes interpret unexpected calls differently. A phone call can feel intrusive if it interrupts something. A message, by contrast, allows the other person to respond when it works for them. Neither perspective is right or wrong. They simply reflect different communication environments. And those environments shape habits that feel completely normal to the people who grew up in them. What's interesting is that generational communication shifts like this happen repeatedly throughout history. When the telephone first appeared, some people felt uncomfortable with it. They preferred writing letters. Phone conversations seemed too sudden, too informal. Later, voicemail created a similar shift. Some people embraced it. Others disliked leaving recorded messages. Every major communication technology changes expectations about how people should interact. The difference today is the speed of those changes. Digital communication evolves quickly. Messaging platforms change. New apps appear. Features update constantly. Each generation adapts to the technology available during their formative years. And those early habits often stay with them for decades. That's why communication styles sometimes feel so different between generations. A baby boomer might interpret texting instead of calling as distant or impersonal. A Gen Z user might interpret calling instead of texting as unnecessarily intense. Both perspectives make sense when you consider the communication environment each generation experienced. Looking ahead, it's likely that communication habits will continue to evolve. New technologies like voice assistants, AI messaging systems, and immersive digital spaces are already changing how people interact. Future generations may develop communication habits that feel just as surprising to us as texting instead of calling once did. What seems normal in one era often feels outdated in another. And those shifts rarely happen because one generation is right and another is wrong. They happen because the world each generation grows up in is different. Technology changes, social environments change, and communication changes with them. Understanding those patterns makes generational differences easier to see. The behaviors that feel unusual today often make perfect sense when you understand the environment that created them. What feels ordinary to one generation often becomes confusing to the next. And every generation assumes their habits are simply the way communication works, until the next generation quietly rewrites the rules. And once you start recognizing how those shifts happen, you begin to notice other changes unfolding the same way, and that's where a much deeper pattern starts to emerge that most people don't fully connect.